A company meeting turned into a jealous showdown between the boss's wife. It was supposed to be a quarterly shareholder meeting, but within 3 minutes, it turned into a fiery showdown between the CEO's wife and his mistress, right in front of 40 stunned employees. At the sleek Manhattan headquarters of Silverstream Media, an emergency shareholder meeting was called on Monday morning. CEO Richard Hammond, a 48-year-old, commanding man with sharp suits and a Rolex, sat at the head of the table, calm as ever. But today was different. To his right sat Julia Hammond, his wife of 20 years and co-founder of the company, her face tense beneath a forced smile. To his left sat Elena Brooks, the 32-year-old communications director, hair glossy, dressed tight, eyes burning with something far more than ambition. Julia didn't look at Elena. Elena, however, made no effort to hide her stare, pointed, deliberate, provocative. Richard started with Q2 growth figures, but no one was really listening. The air was heavy, thick with something unsaid. Every glance, every twitch of a hand felt like the crackle before lightning. And then Julia gently touched Richard's shoulder. Elena snapped. "You can talk about financial strategy, Richard, but have you told them the truth yet?" Silence fell like a blade. Julia turned slowly toward Elena, her eyes glassy, not from weakness, but from a deep, quiet devastation. The storm had begun. Elena stood up. Her eyes burned with defiance. Everyone expected her to back down after the shock, but instead, she walked calmly to the presentation screen, grabbed the remote, and clicked. The screen didn't show Q2 revenue charts. It showed a string of secret photos. Richard and Elena holding hands at a Mexican resort 3 weeks ago. Another photo, kissing in an elevator, timestamped. And finally, a hidden camera video in a hotel suite. The room froze. Julia sat motionless. The CFO swallowed hard. A marketing assistant lowered her eyes. Richard sprang up, voice trembling with fury. "Elena, are you insane?" But Elena didn't blink. She looked at Julia and spoke slowly. "I'm sorry, but I've been the other woman in silence for 2 years. I can't pretend anymore. Not while you sit there like everything is okay." Julia rose to her feet. Her face pale, but her voice steady. "Then, thank you. Now I know who my husband really is." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a stunned board and a company on the brink of chaos. Less than 2 hours after the meeting, the news spread through the building like wildfire. Screenshots of the photos shown earlier flooded internal group chats. Employees whispered. Clients called. Partners pulled out. Emails poured in, canceling contracts without explanation. Silverstream Media, once hailed as invincible in the industry, now trembled from within. Inside Richard's office, he sat slumped. His tie undone, shirt collar open, eyes hollow. Elena walked in without knocking. She gently placed her phone on the desk, a recording of their conversation from 2 weeks ago when Richard promised to divorce Julia after this financial quarter. Richard looked at her, weary. "You're destroying everything we built." Elena whispered. "We built nothing, Richard. It was all a lie, and I was stupid enough to believe in it." She turned and walked away, leaving behind a broken CEO and a company starting to crumble not from losses, but from a secret too heavy to bury. Julia didn't disappear after walking out of the boardroom. She went home, sat silently in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, and opened her laptop. No one knew the company's foundation better than Julia. She had built Silverstream alongside Richard from scratch. And now, betrayed, she didn't cry. She prepared to fight. She sent an email to the board of directors. Attached was a confidential internal report, a personal investigation she'd been compiling for the past 6 months. It documented suspicious expenses charged to the company under Elena's name, first-class flights, 5-star hotels, and consulting fees with no actual projects. This wasn't just infidelity, this was corporate fraud. That night, a Zoom emergency meeting was held. 7 board members, Julia, and her personal attorney. When the screen lit up, Julia simply said, "I'm not here to destroy Silverstream. I'm here for justice." She was no longer the quiet wife behind the empire. She was ready to reclaim it. 3 days later, Richard entered the company's oversight boardroom. But this time, he wasn't the untouchable CEO. He was the subject of an internal investigation and temporary suspension. Julia sat across from him, clad in a charcoal gray blazer. Her eyes no longer carried pain, only the resolve of a woman who had endured too much for too long. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her attorney spoke for her. "We have evidence that Richard Hammond misused company funds for unauthorized personal expenses to the detriment of shareholders." Richard remained silent. There was no one by his side, not even Elena. She had vanished from the company the day after the scandal, leaving no message behind. The board began voting. Within 30 minutes, 6 out of 7 members agreed. Richard was officially suspended from his role as CEO pending investigation. Outside the boardroom, Julia paused by the founder's wall. Next to Richard's portrait was her own, Julia Hammond. She whispered, "I never should have stepped off the stage." The very next morning, Silverstream Media held an internal press conference. The entire company held its breath, awaiting the name of the interim CEO to replace Richard, the man who had sat in that chair for 15 years. Everyone expected Michael, the veteran CFO, or Grace, the sharp COO. But when the board announced the name, gasps filled the room. Julia Hammond, acting CEO. Julia walked to the stage. For the first time in years, she wasn't standing behind Richard's shadow. She was the center of the spotlight. Her face betrayed emotion, but her voice was firm, unwavering. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because Silverstream deserves a real leader, one who is transparent, steadfast, and never lies." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing louder, wave after wave filling the room. Those who had worked under Richard now stood and clapped for Julia. In that moment, a new chapter for Silverstream, and for Julia, had begun. 3 days after Julia assumed the role of acting CEO, an unmarked envelope arrived at her office. Inside was a handwritten letter from Elena Brooks. No one knew where she was. Her social media had gone dark. Her phone was off. But this letter, like a late confession, reached Julia. "I know what I did is unforgivable. But I wasn't a gold digger. I loved Richard. Truly. But I loved the wrong man. When I joined Silverstream, I believed my talent would get me far. But the closer I got to him, the deeper I fell into what I thought was love. Then I realized I was just another name in his long list of women used and discarded. I hurt you, Julia. But I also hurt myself." Julia read the letter over and over. She didn't cry. But for the first time, there was something soft in her eyes, compassion. She folded the letter and placed it in her drawer. She didn't make it public. She didn't use it to further shame Elena. Because sometimes forgiveness isn't weakness, it's strength. Richard returned to the office on Friday afternoon, not to reclaim his title, but to clear out his things. Still, a part of him hoped to see Julia. He needed to talk, just once, as the people they used to be. Julia was on the 20th floor, in the executive suite. When the door opened, she looked up. Their eyes met not with hatred, but with a long, aching silence. Richard stepped inside, cautiously. He spoke softly. "I never meant for things to go this far. I'm sorry." Julia didn't respond at first. Then she walked to her desk and pulled out an old photo, the two of them, 20 years ago, at the launch of Silverstream. She placed it on the table in front of him. "We used to be a team," she said, her voice trembling. "But you chose to walk alone. Now you have to live with that choice." Richard nodded. No excuses. No defenses. As he turned to leave, he paused and asked, "Do you hate me?" Julia replied quietly, "No, but I no longer trust you." 2 months after Richard's departure from Silverstream, the company, once teetering on the edge, began to rebuild. Under Julia's leadership, the communications team restructured their entire strategy. Cancelled contracts were reinstated. Employees began to trust the leadership again, and stock prices, once plunging, slowly climbed back up. But it wasn't just the company that changed. Julia had changed too. She was no longer the quiet woman in the CEO's shadow. She appeared on business magazines. She spoke at conferences about the soft power of integrity. Every time she stepped onto a stage, Julia radiated the quiet strength of someone who had fallen and chosen to rise. During a live TV interview, a journalist asked her, "After everything, do you think you've won?" Julia looked directly into the camera. Her expression wasn't proud, just peaceful. "I wasn't trying to win against anyone. I was just trying not to lose myself." That morning, Julia arrived at the office earlier than usual. She made her own coffee, not the assistant's brew, but the cappuccino Richard used to make for her every morning, back when they were a happy couple. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop. The folder titled 2025 Vision Plan blinked on the screen. But before clicking, she paused. Julia pulled an old envelope from her drawer. Inside was the unsigned divorce paper sent by Richard 3 months ago. She stared at it for a long while. Then, with quiet finality, she tore it into pieces. Not out of forgiveness. Not for reconciliation. But because she no longer needed documents to define who she was. She was no longer someone's wife. She was Julia Hammond, the woman who rebuilt an empire, who survived betrayal, who started over from the ashes. A new day began. And she smiled, not for anyone else, but because she had finally found herself again.